Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lee. I lead the Vivli effort as our CEO. I'm delighted to see everyone today. And for those of you at dinner, it was wonderful to have you here at dinner and to see everyone, some new faces and some old friends. It's my great honor to have Dr. Steffen Thirstrup with us today. He is the Chief Medical Officer at the European Medicines Agency and a visionary leader whose commitment to advancing healthcare innovation has been instrumental in shaping the future of medicines across Europe. Today, Dr. Thirstrup will be discussing the European health data space with us. It's a really groundbreaking initiative poised to revolutionize the way health data is managed, accessed, and utilized. Steffen is an MD and board certified in clinical pharmacology and therapeutics. He holds a PhD in pharmacology and has a background in clinical internal medicine with an emphasis on adult respiratory medicine. He has a distinguished career in the regulatory agencies and was at the Danish Medicines Agency first before coming to the European Medicines Agency. He's uniquely qualified to discuss the EHDS, and we look forward to hearing from him today. So, of course, EMA has been a key player in this area. So we'll have a short time for questions after his talk. So thank you so much for being with us today. Dr. Thirstrup.
Many thanks, Rebecca, and many thanks to Vivli for having me here today to give a presentation of the European health data space. And I hope, can I see my presentation here on the screen as well? That would be helpful. So European health data space, or EHDS, is the topic of my presentation. I think I want to start somewhere else, just to make sure that we are on the same page here. Europe is not the United States of Europe, for good and for bad. We are a political union of 27 member states who have agreed to collaborate, again, with all those challenges, and I think I'll come back to some of the challenges linked to the implementation, that at least what I see for the European health data space in doing this across a political union of 27 member states. So we are united in diversity. That's the motto, and diversity sometimes becomes a little bit too much for having to be united. So that's sometimes the challenge. Another note just to kick off today is, of course, also maybe to clarify the difference between the European Medicines Agency and the US FDA. Fundamentally, we only do drugs. We don't do cosmetics, tobacco, food. We do a little bit in medical devices, but that's only when it comes to drug-device combinations and companion diagnostics. The rest of the devices, also the high-class devices, they are dealt with by notified bodies. We sometimes, or we actually manage some of the expert panels related to the high level of devices. So just to give you a flavor of where I'm coming from as opposed to the US setting. And then, of course, the challenges of being part of a union of political. So this is the political vision of the European health data space. And I once heard a European commissioner, not the president, but the vice president of the European Commission, talking about the European health data space as roaming for healthcare. Because in Europe, we managed to deal with the roaming for mobile phone data, so you can move across without being completely, get your pockets emptied by paying for data. It's still expensive, but there is some level of roaming. And the idea is, first and foremost, the first idea about the European health data space on the left side of this picture, namely creating the opportunity for all citizens in Europe to access their own healthcare data and bring them across the border. So if I, as a Dane living in the Netherlands, go on vacation in Spain and fall sick, then I can show the Spanish doctor my health records from Denmark and the Netherlands and what he adds and so forth. You can imagine. So that is the concept, and that's created what is called My Health at EU. So that's the population, the patient-facing part of it. And the idea is, of course, to empower patients more to get access to healthcare, but also enable the healthcare professionals to deal better with patients coming across the border. But there is, of course, a secondary use of these data, because if you suddenly manage to gather healthcare information, and I'll come back to what kind of healthcare information we are planning to collect in Europe for the health data space. If you collect them in Europe, we are roughly 500 million people. You will get a huge database. So that opens the opportunity for do a lot of secondary use and data analytics into this. And that's where the interest of the European Medicines Agency and other bodies, of course, come in. What can we use these data for? And I'll give you a flavor, because we're already running some projects that are pathfinders pathfinders for the European health data space. And this is, of course, also the political vision that you, by having access to the entire union's health data, you can maybe help shape political positions, you can help shape policy interventions for diseases and so forth. So this is the vision. But these visions don't come without challenges from a regulatory and legal perspective. So there are a lot of other legislation and legislative acts that is intervened into the European health data space. I'm pretty sure you're all aware of our very complicated general data protection regulation, which is not the easiest thing in the world, but it's there. And of course, now we suddenly talk about every citizen's data being put into a platform, and how do we keep privacy in accordance with this regulation. On the other hand, there is a cross-border health directive which allow and give every citizen in Europe to seek healthcare outside their place of living, as long as within the union. So you have the opportunity as a citizen to move across borders, and therefore it would facilitate that cross-border movement if you can move your data with you, and it will help both you as a patient, but it will also help the treating physician in that one. Then there's, of course, a lot of things linked to the data governance, cybersecurity, and finally also a proposal to create a European digital identity. Many, but not all, European countries have a digital identity or a personal identifier. Denmark, where I come from, I'm born with a number that stays with me. Most likely it stays with me after my death, because you can still track the data that was linked to this identifier. And whatever I do in the Danish healthcare system is linked to my personal identifier number. So when I go to the doctor, when I go to the dentist, when I go to a pharmacy, when I'm submitted to hospital, if I deliver blood samples, if I get a pathology answer, if I have a cancer, and finally when I die, what was the cause of death. So creating that across Europe will of course also enable the way you can track data, but also maybe you will feel George Orwell's coming here that you can track. But anyway, we all have an iPhone in our pocket and no problem sharing our location and health data with Apple and Google and so forth. Or have we? I don't know. That's a personal statement. So on the left-hand side, we have the further vision of the European Commission, because they picked health as the first area where they want to have a data space. And so they have plans to create data spaces for energy, industry, finance, skills, climate, agriculture, public administration, and mobility. And they picked health as the first one. Interesting. So let's see, we are the test tube, let's put it that way. We are the monkeys, or the guinea pigs, for how we can do this in Europe, to create a pan-European data space for subject that has both an interest for the general public, or for a sub-part of the general public, but also have some big interest for policymakers. So this is, and I don't expect you to read all the details, and I'm pretty sure if you like, Rebecca can share the slides with you afterwards. I put in some hyperlinks in some of them as well. But of course, what we are planning to share, if we start at the upper left, electronic health record data, that's obvious, but also data on the doctors or healthcare professionals that are treating you, their specialization, where it happens, registers and data from medical products, but also medical devices, things that are automatically generated from wearables and so forth, but also socioeconomic factors and things that could have and determine on health, where you live, your education, and so forth. Whatever we can find here. And I think for you, for Vivli, I think these two, and the colors may not come through so clearly, but I read it out. So data from research cohorts, questionnaires, surveys related to health, and also data from clinical trials and clinical studies, and also studies and utilization. And here we have some of the European, we are good at acronyms. So CTIs, the clinical trial register, the SOHOs are substance of human origin. So that's semen, milk, tissue, blood, name it. MDR is medical device regulation, IVDR, in vitro diagnostic regulation. So I think these are where Vivli can, you maybe relate to what we are going to collect here, but we are going to collect much, much more. But it also means that you as a study subject, as a potential patient who volunteer for a clinical trial, you will actually also be able to see your data from that clinical trial in your My Data part of it, and it will be part of the entire health database that authorities and policy can use for policy making. So just to give you an example of how complicated this is going to work, imagine, and here we're only talking about the secondary use. I won't dwell more with the primary use of these data. So the secondary use, the EMA wants to explore something in a data set in the future European health data space. And on the top you have the data holder. The data holder will be the body that holds your data. That may be the electronic health records in member states and individual member states, so it may be pathology data and so forth. But we have to create, or there will be created, a health data access board. So that's the intermediary that will deal with the data. So the data, I think the mantra is data stays local. So we don't have to transfer the data. And again, to protect privacy, data will be in the individual countries close to the patients. But you can then do research local, and you can transfer the results. So if EMA is going to request, there will be a set of data catalogs where we will catalog of different kinds of data. EMA will have to, first of all, consult these catalogs to identify the right set of data that we want to do our investigation in, and we will ask for permission. So we review the data. It will be reviewed not by us, but it will be reviewed by the Health Data Access Board. Hopefully we will be granted access. I put a watch on here because this will take time. And then if allowed and approved, there will be a request from the data holder. So the data will be collected in the different data sets and metadata in the national authority, national databases, not only in one country, it could be across the entire union. The data will then be transferred into a secure environment where we can do our data processing, but we can only do the analysis, and we can do the analysis in this secure environment, and we can only retrieve the results in an anonymized version. So again, protecting privacy here. You may be able to see things in this room in a protected environment, but you cannot take the data on an individual level out and use. So we can then do we will have the analysis outcome, and we will then, because this is in the interest of the public, we will be obliged to publish the results of any of these minings within, is it 18 months, so within 1.5 years. So nothing is going to, I think that's the intention. Whoever wants to data mine in the public's, in the citizens' data, is also obliged to share the results publicly. So nothing hidden here, nothing secret going on. If someone is mining, the results will have to be for the greater good for those who actually provided the data. But this will, there is a euro sign here, it will cost money and it will take time. So of course the question is, and that I think is for the future to show, how agile will this system be? What kind of quick regulatory decisions will we actually be able to take using these data? We could imagine, and I'm thinking about when we rolled out the COVID-19 vaccines, so how quickly could we pick up on unknown side effects that had a deterrent? We did that for the J&J vaccine in the Nordics. We did that in 7 weeks. I'm not sure this system will be able to do it in 7 weeks. I don't know. I hope. I sincerely hope. But you could fear that it could be a complicated system to do for good reasons, because we're dealing with privacy and so forth. So maybe there will be a need for the opportunity to do quick searches when we talk about safety of new products, especially products that we rolled out in types of vaccines for pandemic. That's a good example, where we suddenly treat, if not the entire population, then at least large parts of the population. So this is at least the intention, how this is going to work. When I saw this slide, because it's not a slide I created, some of my colleagues created it, I thought, yeah, okay, this is nice from a data privacy perspective, but it's also a complicated system that have a little bit of flavor of bureaucracy and yeah. Let's see. So at least that's the intention as it needs now. So there are a lot of Pathfinder initiatives that are going on and has been going on. And this list, and please note, this list is far from comprehensive. I picked those that I, at least myself, were aware of and have been talking to people working there. The first one is, of course, very important that it's driven by the European Commission. You know, how do we develop and deploy the IT infrastructure? Because it's no secret that you may see Europe as a digitized society. Well, that holds for some part of Europe, but there are also parts of Europe where getting Wi-Fi access or 3G, I didn't say 5 or 4G, I said 3G, is a challenge. Germany has a big, so we're not talking about minor countries. Some big countries have real big issues, still using paper files in their hospital system, so digitization is still on its advance in large parts of Europe. So we will have to have that infrastructure in place before we can go to the next step of having a unified healthcare data space here. So there are currently 17 partners, and they are running use cases to find out how can we roll this out. Then there is the TAHEDAS, or TUAT, European Health Data Space, 2 different, and I put here 13 with an exclamation mark because 30 countries is more than 27 European EU Union, so that goes a little bit beyond. But they have been doing a lot of interesting studies and also creating guidelines and technical specification. There is a study called Facilitate that looks on and that's more academic and small, medium-sized enterprises and patients. So patient access to clinical trial data and reuse of such data. I think that could be of interest for Vivli to dig into to facilitate. And that's why I put, and that's European Union or European Commission sponsored study. And then I put Darwin here, and I will show you Darwin because that's a network that the European Medicines Agency have set up to use this as a pathfinder. Both as a pathfinder for the European health data space, but in particular for the secondary use of healthcare data in our own decision-making process. And Darwin stands for, and I will see if I can get it right, it's the Data Analytics and Real-World Evidence Interrogation Network of EU. I have a colleague who is fantastic at coming up with acronyms. He could have a brilliant career in pharma, creating all the names, you know, for the clinical trials. But he came up with Darwin. So this is the Data Analytics Real-World Evidence Interrogation Network of the European Union. So currently, and this is increasing, we have added on data sources over the years, and we are currently having 25 data sources from 13 different European countries, and we cover 140 million citizens of Europe. Of course, not all the data for all 140 million, but the 140 individual patients, some of them give genomic data, some of them give prescription data, some of them give, so we don't have an entire data for all entire data set for all 140. The idea about the way Darwin is built is actually the way the health data space will be built as well. It will be the data. So if you take the yellow box is the Darwin Coordination Center. We are financing it, but it's located in the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. So they do this. They are scientists who can do data. They are data scientists. And the data partners, they are located in the different member states, so the different databases. I'll show you that, some examples of the databases in the next slide. And then the different countries have data permit authorities. Some of the data the coordination center have direct access to, but the rest of them will have to go via a data permit center. A little bit like the middle bar that I showed you in this complicated data access slide. So when you request data from the coordination center, it goes to the permit authority. The permit authority gets access to the data, do the analysis, runs the algorithm that the coordination center have created to solve the research question, and we get the aggregated results back, and we can accumulate that for all data centers. And if an EMA is the questioner, of course, we will get the aggregated results back. And our thinking is how can we, and where we are and what we're using Darwin for is how can we use these kind of data for our internal decision-making process. And all these four-letter acronyms, these are some of our scientific committees, the Committee for Human Medicines, the Safety Committee, the Orphan Committee, and the Scientific Advice Working Party. And we agreed on a common data model because that's also fundamental. If we don't have the common data model, we cannot exchange these data. So that's a mini version of the European health data space, and I'll give you some examples later on, where not concrete examples, but high-level examples. Here's some of the databases that we are currently on board, and you can look. Some of them are primary care health database. We have a big IQVIA database in Belgium. We have the UK CPRD Gold database. We have a hospital database in France. We have genomic data from Estonia, a biobank there. We have the Norwegian linked health registers. We are onboarding the Danish one. We have IQVIA from Germany. So you can see a lot of different data sources. And again, the plan is to add roughly 10 new data partners every year for the next couple of years. And here are some examples, and not concrete examples on studies we have done. I just wanted to show you some of our thinking here. Where can we use these kind of data? Where are we already trialing out with our scientific committees to use data from the Darwin? So disease epidemiology, really relevant for our orphan committee. You know, is this actually an orphan disease? How frequent is this disease in Europe as compared to globally and other places? What is the current standard of care and management of a certain disease? That often come up in regulatory decision. Is the study that has been conducted by industry, is this comparing the new product to the standard of care? And what is standard of care in Europe as compared to standard of care where the trial was run, maybe? So we can look into what is clinician management. Drug utilization studies, also to support pharmacovigilance. Discussion around the design and feasibility of studies. Is it actually possible to recruit patients with a certain disease or a certain level of disease? Can we find patients who have been treated with 3 lines of whatever chemotherapy, and how many do we find of them, and how long do they live? Representativeness of clinical trials as compared to how representative are the clinical study population to the European population. Increasingly interesting problem, because we see more and more studies being conducted outside Europe and outside US. I didn't say China, but we see studies coming from other populations that are different to the European and the US population. Of course, effectiveness studies and safety studies. Effectiveness studies is also relevant for the payers, and they are downstream to us, of course. And then impact of regulatory action. So if we restrict an indication or broaden out an indication or put in a warning, is this actually being taken up by the healthcare systems? And so do we do the right things, kind of quality assurance on regulatory decision making? This is just a few examples, and we had trialed out some of them. I just wanted to then park the European health data space for 2 or 3 slides and talk about access to clinical trial data in Europe as it looks now. So disregarding what the European health data space will show in the future, because we are transitioning the clinical trial regulation. We are transitioning into the new clinical trial regulation in Europe. The clinical trial regulation was adopted in January 2022, and with that came a centralized system for the coordination of approval of clinical trials in Europe. And that's both for clinical trials run by commercial sponsors and clinical trials run by academia. So every clinical trial, independing on who is the sponsor. And that system is called CTIS, the Clinical Trials Information System. And I'm pretty sure you have heard about all the bugs and the challenges of running stuff in CTIS. And I should be the first to admit that system it had inborn errors, if not inborn errors of metabolism, which have now been corrected, most of them. There's still a few bugs, but we are working on it's up and running now. And it has to be up and running because as end of January 25, all clinical trials that are still ongoing but has been authorized according to the old legislation will have to be transferred into CTIS. So fundamentally, from January 2025, every clinical trial in Europe is to be found in CTIS. And the idea about CTIS is, as opposed to in the old days where you as an applicant had to go to the countries where you wanted to run the trial, and then they had to coordinate the assessment of the application and so forth. Now there is a single point of contact where you can submit, and then the authorities, I think we can start here before I go into explanation. There will be a public website, and I think that's the interesting one when it comes to access to data, because there you, as a citizen or whoever you are in Europe, also outside Europe, can see all ongoing clinical trials, all finalized clinical trials, and you will be able to see get access to the results of those clinical trials. Not raw data, but on an aggregated level, like in a publication. So the end of trial notification will trigger a request to the sponsor to submit the data within a certain time frame. So there'll be access to all clinical trials in Europe here, which is a big step forward. We will have to see how compliant sponsors will be, but then I think I think there's not so much carrot, but maybe some sticks we can come up with to make this work. So the CTIS has a secured area. There's a workspace for the sponsors and whoever supports the sponsors. So if you as a pharma company have a CRO running it, the CRO can get access here. And then there's a workspace for the authorities. That means that's where the coordinated assessment of the application is taking place. And this is running fairly good because EMA and the member states have created a clinical trials facilitation group that's now called a coordination group, and they are doing a great work to make that coordination work. And regulatory authorities are, in Europe, used to work together. EMA has their 30 years anniversary next year, so we have 30 years experience in collaborating. When it comes to ethics committees, they have no or very limited experience in working together. They are not EU coordinated, and that is creating a lot of challenges because the timelines for assessment is, of course, not too long, let me put it that way. It's the interest of moving clinical trials forward. So the authorities can keep the timelines, but the ethics committees are understaffed and uncoordinated, and that creates a problem, and it's difficult to solve. And everybody who says, couldn't we have a pan-European ethics committee, will be, if not executed, but then pointed at it. It's currently a no-go to discuss. And again, coming back to my first slide, Europe is united in diversity. And although you should think ethics is more or less a harmonized thing, again, in Europe, with different backgrounds, there are a lot of things that are viewed upon differently. If we take some of the most contentious one is, of course, What about pregnancy protection? Is that allowed in all Catholic countries? Maybe not, so maybe it's not going to be mandatory. So you can see there can be these differences in assessing the ethics. So that's at least cities and access to clinical trials. And this is how it looks at the moment, and it's a little bit busy slide. We have divided the type of data that you can get out trials into different categories. One is therapeutic use trials, so fundamentally what was called phase 4 trials in the old days. All data will be published by the end of the decision for the trial. Category 2, I think, is the best one because these are the phase 2 and phase 3 trials, and there will be a 30 months delay after end of trial until they get published, or should be published in the trial system. So these are the current plans, and we are also working, and I didn't put a slide in here, but EMA is also. We had a break to publish clinical trials under COVID-19 because we had other things to do. Let me put it that way. But we are now starting again publishing all the clinical data that have been submitted to us as part of an application for marketing authorization. And I say all clinical trials, so it's not only the phase 3 trials and not only the trials that has been published in New England Journal of Medicine or whatever they get published in, but also the phase 2 trials and the phase 1 trials that sometimes never get published in a peer-reviewed journal because who cares about a bioequivalent study, you know? But they will be there, yeah. So that was an intermezzo talking about clinical data in Europe disregarding European health data space. So what's next? So see, this is the timeline. It all started in May 2022 with the European Commission proposing this. And we are now at the end of the trialogue. And what is a trialogue? In Europe, the decision-making the European Commission proposes legislation. The European Parliament, so these are elected members of the European Parliament elected by the citizens of Europe, so coming from all member states, they have the first negotiation. But in the end, it's what is called the European Council, and that's the Council of the Ministers. So this would be the health ministers who decide. That's the trilogue, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council that finally agree on a law or legislation put into place. And that's just ended. That means, yes, we will have the European health data space. So the final text is now being, I don't think it's been published yet in the official OGA, that's not O.J. Simpson, but it's the official journal of the Union. And as soon as that gets published, that's day 0. So that's when the clock starts with if the legislation says anything about implementation phase and when something's going to be done. So we assume this will be published very soon. And then we go 2 years into the autumn of 2026. And until then, the European Commission, and we will have a new European Commission because we just had elections, they will have time to adopt AI and DI. These are implementing acts and delegating acts. So actually, what we could call guidelines that we're going to implement this. And then hopefully in autumn 2028, this will start working, and we should then expect to have a full European health data space by 2030. So you might invite me back in a handful of years and I can give you an update. Anyway, so this is my last slide because this is ambitious for sure, and implementation, even we have until 2030, I guess will be a challenge. There will need to be substantial infrastructure investment, as I already mentioned, in digitized infrastructure, some more in one member state than others. We are already unevenly digitized, and of course also unevenly digitized in healthcare when it comes to healthcare. And this will also be highly depending on public trust, because who would like to share their most intimate healthcare data with the government or whoever they see stands behind the European health data space? The more critical ones will be concerned about cybersecurity. There will be ethical discussions around the secondary use. And one of the big discussions we had while the proposal was on table was whether patients could whether the system should be an opt-in or an opt-out system. So whether patients across Europe could say, well, I want to share my data, so that's opt-in. And I went to Brussels and said, from an EMA perspective, opt-in doesn't make any sense when it comes to secondary use, because it will only be a subgroup of very altruistic and dedicated citizens who want to opt in, and what about the rest? So it ended, luckily, on an opt-out model. And there may even be allowed for different opt-out options in the member states. So you can say, well, I'm okay having the majority of my data, but I want to opt out on my genetic data, or I want to opt out on other sets of data. This will hopefully mean that we will have a representative data set of Europeans, but it could also mean that patients with certain diseases want to opt out. What about patients with psychiatric illnesses that are concerned about Big Brother watching you or whatever? Would they like to share their data? I don't know, but I mean, you're just speculating. We could end up in a situation where we will have to discuss the representativeness of the data in the data. Let's see how big the opt-out actually will be. But that also comes back to the public trust, of course, and we've seen with the COVID-19 vaccine uptake. There are countries in Europe where the vaccine uptake has been enormously low, despite the government doing a big effort, but patients don't trust, citizens don't trust the government. So why should they, if they don't want to take a vaccine because it's recommended by the government, why should they share their data with the government? Huh? So we're going to have a big challenge also there in building trust. And then also ethical issues around the secondary use, what is being used for. But I think that's where, coming back to the layer cake slide, I show you that this data access board will be the one that is you will agree, you have to agree, and there needs to be a set of ethical standards on what kind of analysis you can do. So these are the challenges, and this is another challenge, but if you want to reach out to me, feel free, here's my email address. And I said to you, Rebecca, you're welcome to share my slides. I put in deliberately some hyperlinks at the bottom if you want to dig into the details. Many thanks.
Thank you so much. I think we have a mic for those that want to ask questions, and I also have some questions coming in from online, so
Good.
I'll moderate those here. So if you have a question, if you could raise your hand, and Julie will bring the mic over to you. You should use it. Okay, I'll also use a mic. So questions, if you could raise your hand, otherwise I'll go. Okay, great. Up front here. Thank you so much, Steffen. I'll start off by saying, before your presentation, it was a little nebulous to me. I've read a lot about the EHDS and CTIS, but this made this much more clear to me, and thank you for your very candid presentation.
To be honest, Rebecca, it was also a little bit nebulous to me when you, not your invitation, but the details of EHDS. So this has also been helpful for me because I had to dig a level deeper, because I've been much more involved in Darwin and what we do there. So that part of the similarities are understood. But the bigger picture that I showed you in some of the slides was, to be honest, I hadn't read the proposal in that level of details, because, again, I think we had that discussion last night, and I think you also grasped that from my presentation. The European Medicines Agency is not going to be the main driver of implementing this. Mm-hmm. We have a huge interest in the secondary use of the data that this system hopefully will bring.
Right, and we're also interested in secondary use, of course. So, question, if you could tell us your name and affiliation, and then your question.
Sure. Hi, Steffen. I'm Matt Ritelli from Eli Lilly and Company, and thank you for that. Actually, for me, made things much more clear. One of the questions I had is that in that middle layer, where I agree 100%, there needs to be some ethical principles established. But is that also going to be federated analysis, or will the data actually come into that area? That's going
to be a federated model. So that will build on the federated model. So depending on the type of question and the databases you want to get access to, that middle layer, the data access governance board, or whatever it was called, will then request the data in a federated model. So you'll get the data into this data holder, equivalent to the satellites you had on the Darwin, and that's where the analysis will be. So the data will stay local. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then, can I do one more? From a trust perspective, how much opportunity is there for public input or deliberation as the overarching EHDS is being developed? Because I think that's, you can't just implement it and then say, here, please opt in or opt out.
Good
Swallow.
question.
Yeah, of course, there have been a lot of opportunities for public consultation during the legislative process. But to be honest, I don't think if you stop a man on the street in Amsterdam and ask him on his view on the European health data space, he will think I've been smoking something, which you can do in Amsterdam, of course. But anyway, I think there will be. I don't know how that is built into the process, but there will certainly be a need to have that consultation as part of the trust-building process. So patients, and not even patients, I keep saying patients, I'm too much a doctor here, citizens will need to understand that this is for the greater good, which means also for their own good. Yeah. So they're going to be need for consultations and explanations. Education. Because I'm pretty sure there will be a lot of citizens who can see the benefit of the primary use to say, oh, okay, I can take out my app and I can see all my, I got all, and I think many healthcare systems already offer some kind of access to health records or results of blood samples and so forth, but being able actually to take them with you across Europe, I think many patients or citizens can see that benefit. But when it comes to the secondary use, and if we are not explicit about that there will be an opportunity for secondary use, then we will lose trust immediately, because then it will be seen like the deep state is digging into our data. So that's a good question. I don't know the details, but I certainly agree with you.
Okay. Can you raise your hands high?
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm David Peliquin. I'm a lawyer here at Ropes & Gray in Boston. I advise a lot of pharmaceutical companies and academic medical centers in the US and elsewhere on secondary uses of data. And one of the challenges I've seen for the last 10 years or so are questions arising, and you alluded to this in your remarks, about the GDPR and how that interplays with research uses of data. And one of the challenges for secondary research that a lot of people have run into is, well, what is the basis for processing those data under the GDPR? They're all sensitive, special categories of data, usually subject to heightened protection. And sometimes we have seen guidance from the European Data Protection Board and others that has not necessarily facilitated those uses, I think it's fair to say. And so the question I would have is, what consultation has happened with the European Data Protection Board and others that enforce GDPR to ensure that some of those issues around basis of processing won't become a roadblock for the secondary use of data from the health data space?
Without being a detailed legislative expert here, my understanding is that the European Commission is very aware that the General Data Protection Regulation is a big hurdle, and that they need to take that carefully into consideration. And well, they created the law themselves, so I'm pretty sure there has been discussions there, and there will be ongoing discussions. How are we going to create a system that is compliant with the laws and regulations we already have in place?
Right, thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Other questions?
Yeah, we got a lady there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Chapman from the MRCT Center. Thank you so much for this overview. It seems like there's clear benefits to this effort, and you know, you mentioned the ethics committees and some of the challenges related to that. I was wondering if there's been you know, dedicated, you know, consideration of potential risks for the secondary use, and you know, it seems like maybe less risk to any individual contributor, but in particular, I'm interested in, group risks and how that might be mitigated. Thank you.
There have been a lot of discussions, and I haven't followed them closely, but been part of a few of them in the European Parliament and in the European Commission, inviting patient organizations and so forth to express their views. And again, I think what I heard is mixed feedback. Some or most patient organizations see the obvious benefit, both for the individual patient, but also for the opportunity to, better access to healthcare and also for research. But again, have concerns around the secondary use and who is going to be able to do secondary use. Will it be governmental bodies like the EMA? Will it be pharma industry? Would it be academic researchers and so forth? And as I understand it, so far the plan is that going to be governmental agencies and academic institutions with a well-planned and approved research protocol. At a later stage, maybe industry, but I don't think industry will be the first that get access to this kind of data. Again, out of a privacy, and I think it'll be a challenge to convince citizens that industry, independent of industry having good intentions to do this, I don't think at least to start off with, that's my impression.
Thank you. Ben Rhodes?
Hi, thank you. As she said, Ben Rhodes from Eli Lilly. And I think I remember on your slide when you were showing the three bars, there was a section about the results would be published 18 months after. So is the plan to include, similar to a clinical trial registration results type of activity, where the question would be registered with the study plan and then the results would be posted in that type of format?
I assume so, but I don't think we have that. That's not been specified in the legislation yet, but I think that will be part of the implementing act and delegating act, because what we've done with Darwin is that we run this via the network of pharmacoepidemiological studies, so you can actually see the study protocols being published there, and when the results come out of the Darwin network, they get posted there, and of course many of them end up in a publication, and I'm pretty sure the Commission will look to the same, because we cannot, they're going to be somewhere fundamentally. So yes, that would be my assumption.
Okay, and my second question, which is unrelated, is there any plan that health technology assessments or payers would be using the same type of system to try and get background?
That will be my understanding, but this will be the unified European health data space. So pricing and reimbursement bodies, STA bodies, will of course get access as well if they like and have studies. Yeah.
Dawei Lin, NIAID, NIH. I wonder if there's any individual countries in European that may use the similar framework to do it as an experiment, before as a European-wise.
That's a good question. I don't think some of the Nordic countries have a very widely developed digitized healthcare system, but I don't think there is to the same level of detail. There might be primary access. I think I'm looking back thinking in Denmark I can access pretty all my healthcare records, but there is not a unified secondary use access. So that will be depending on it's governed by, in the Nordic countries where there are a lot of registers, it's governed by a data governance board, where you, or maybe public research institutions, so you'll have to go via that governance board, a little bit like the middle of the layer cake, and say, here's my research question, I want to look into how many patients got prescription of Viagra last year, and how many of them were males, and how old were they, and did any women get it? These kind of questions. But you'll have to come with a research question.
Okay. I'm going to go to a few questions online, and then we'll tap back to the room. So one of the questions is, there is now, as of a few months, an ethics committee group run by the EU Commission. This is helping information sharing and process streamlining. There's also an ongoing project for regulators and ethics committees to work together and streamline their assessment timelines and requests to sponsors. The CTIS application integrates applications to both regulatory authorities in one applications.
I fully agree.
Yeah, so,
But thanks for pointing that out, that they are work, and maybe I was a little bit too rough on pointing fingers at the ethics committees, but so
I don't
far
know
it's
if that's
been
a
a challenge,
question,
but I think it's
that's what he's thinking. And maybe, I'm sorry, that I thought that was a question, but I guess it's not.
I thank for the clarification.
So will Switzerland be part of this effort for secondary use access?
Oh, say that again.
Will Switzerland be part of this effort for secondary use access?
Potentially, yes.
Okay. So there's subtle differences in the way EU countries look at anonymization. What is the expectation regarding the harmonized approach across EU countries on this?
Well, there needs to be some kind of harmonization if this is going to work, and I think that's part of the, first of all, now the European politicians have agreed that this is the way we're going to go. There will need to be work done in the individual member states to achieve the data infrastructure, do the discussions with the public. So a lot of the success of this is also depending on how national politicians is going to explain this to their citizens.
Okay, great. And the last question I'll ask is, will the EDCTP sponsored trials also be part of the CTIS? So there's a couple of CTIS questions, so that's the last one I'll ask.
Every clinical trial run in Europe, if it's a clinical trial, not registered trials, but clinical trials, has to go in CTIS.
Okay, great. Okay, let's go back to the room.
I was curious about.
Could you say your name
Oh,
and
I'm sorry,
affiliation,
Barbara
please?
Steiner from Mass General Hospital.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm curious about the risks of hacking and risks of government changeovers and security of data for people who have signed up. I'm sure that's been something you all have discussed. And the other question I have is there a way to have an anonymized set of secondary data instead of, so that you could be part of a database like that but not have your name associated with it for protection, or at least for...
The hacking question, I'm pretty sure everything will be done to avoid that.
Right.
And there are all the, I showed you all the different legislation on cybersecurity and so forth. To be honest, and that's my private opinion, I don't think we will ever create a system that is 100% watertight. That's, I can see how many hacking attacks the European Medicines Agency gets on a daily basis. We would be interesting to lay that down, whoever is trying to do that. And of course, they're also interested in getting access there to company confidential data, which we are storing. So I don't think we can completely exclude. I think we are going, and I'm pretty sure we're going to do our utmost to make sure that this is a secure system at the highest level. And your second question, sorry, I forgot that.
One question was if there's, I guess if people would like to be part of this,
Yeah,
be
the anonymous,
so
right?
that to
Yeah,
protect their identity.
yeah. I don't think there are any plans to say, well, I want to contribute with my data, but I want to be anonymized, because then to what do you want to anonymize? Do you want to anonymize your age, your gender, your social economic? We will have enormous checkbook on what we are going to leave out, because knowing that there is a person with hypertension, we don't know it's a woman, how old she, that doesn't make any sense from a research perspective. I think that the crux of the matter is that you deliver you put your data in, but the security and the anonymization lies in the middle layer, that those who do the data mining, do the studies, cannot see who you are, and they cannot take any data out that can identify you. And then, of course, the next question is, and that's also something we are being challenged when it comes to publication of clinical trials. If we are working, or if we get an application for an orphan drug in a very orphan space, you can actually or there is the potential that you can de-identify patients by going backwards, because if you have a trial with, let's say, 50 patients in a very rare condition, first of all, the patient community knows who those 50 patients are, and then backtracking a female who is 24, then you can suddenly, it's going to be those two girls over there. Mm-hmm. So, but anyway, I think we will do our utmost to protect that you can be re-identified. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Because
I think
it's nobody's interest to be identified.
Thank you so much. So that was a great session. I think we're going to move on because of time to the next panel. If you didn't get your question in, you'll be able to ask Dr. Thirstrup your question during the panel. We will have a Q&A. So thank you. I'd like to invite... Sure. Okay, so we're just bringing up our panelists, but I will introduce the other panelists that are with us today. And we're bringing up our other panelist from EFPIA, but I'll introduce our others. We all know Dr. Thirstrup, who's sitting to my left. Next to him is, so I'm just going to introduce everyone by name, title, and affiliation. And then I'm going to give each of them 1 minute to introduce themselves regarding their interest in the EHDS and their relevant experience in data reuse. Okay, so to the left of Steffen is David Leventhal from Pfizer. David is the head of data sharing and disclosure at Pfizer. So to the left of David is another David, David McAllister. So if you direct your questions to either David, please let us know which David it is. So David McAllister, professor from the University of Glasgow. David is also with us and also does research on Vivli, but also a lot more, so hopefully you'll let us know a bit more about your research. And then on screen with us from EFPIA is Aneta Tyszkiewicz, Director of Digital and Data from EFPIA. So thank you for joining us, Aneta. Could you say something so we can hear your audio?
Yes, good morning. I hope that you can hear me.
Yes, it sounds wonderful. Thank you, Aneta, for joining us. Okay, so I'll start with you, David. Would you like to give us a short 1-minute introduction? David Leventhal. Sorry, David L.
This is going to happen the whole
Yes,
time.
multiple times.
So thanks, everybody. I'm David Leventhal, and
A little closer to the mic,
closer?
please. Yes.
Okay. Yes, I lead our data sharing and disclosure activities at Pfizer. We sustain our commitments to open science, and I think that's evidenced through our partnership with Vivli. And I think our interest here, of course, is how do we make this all work? We are committed to data sharing as part of what it is that we do. We just have to. There's a lot of devil in these details, and but I also think there's tremendous opportunity. On top of what will be potentially difficult, I think the opportunities around clinical trials and how we recruit, retain, and treat our participants in the conduct of those trials can be enabled through EHDS. So I view it as a great opportunity and look forward to talking more about the challenges, but also where we should pull together to work on these problems.
David McAllister.
Okay. So yeah, my name's David McAllister. Thanks very much for inviting me, Rebecca.
Of course.
Great fun. So I am a clinical academic, so qualified as a doctor, work in the research space, and I've worked in secondary analysis of data for about 15 years. When Steffen was presenting it, the first ever routinely collected healthcare data project I did, I got the data on a CD that was posted to us. So we've come a really long way in 15 years. 90,000 patients on a CD, you'd get arrested for that now. So I work at the University of Glasgow. I do secondary analysis of routinely collected healthcare data and over the past 7-8 years, individual participant data from clinical trials. I also work for Public Health Scotland, which is our national data agency in Scotland. I did a lot of work there during the pandemic, looking at risk of COVID in different populations. And I also work for NICE, which is the UK regulator who approves drugs or not. I sit on one of the health technology committees there. And yeah, it was really exciting to hear about all the plans.
Thank you, David. And Aneta.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you very much again for having me. So I represent the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, and we overall represent over 2,000 companies of all sizes operating in Europe. I already took actually a liberty to start answering some of the questions in the chat during Stefan's presentation. I hope, Stefan, that you don't mind, but I have to say that I've been literally living and breathing the EHDS for the last 6 years. So I have been involved in the discussions during the negotiations of that file, presenting the industry position, and now I will be also following and sharing the industry views during the implementation period. So from the perspective of the innovation-based industry, this is obviously a critical proposal that can contribute to the innovation-friendly ecosystem. Although there are certain challenges related to its implementation and greater clarity is needed. And that's also, it's certainly been proved in the number of questions you've posed about some of the key provisions. And we cannot really answer all of these questions because they are not defined in the final text of the EHDS. Hence, I'm very much looking forward to this discussion to discuss the different roles also in the industry would have in that future framework. Will be data, obviously users, potentially benefiting from this more consistent data access models, but at the same time will be data holders and will be obliged to share a broad range of different data to the ecosystem. So thank you.
Thank you, Aneta. I do think this is the perfect panel to start discussing both these opportunities and really the challenges of this bold initiative. I really have to congratulate EMA for coming forward and discussing. I know you won't be actually implementing this, but that you're here really on the hot seat a bit, Stefan, to come forward and discuss this. I do, before you were here, it was hard for me, I have to be quite frank, to see what the opportunities were, but I do see that this is the potential to be a transformative opportunity for all of Europe. And we're here really to discuss this. I see some parallels with GDPR. In the early days, we weren't sure what it was. It was a bit nebulous, and I do see the forms of what this could potentially be for us. So thank you. So let me kick off with a few questions. I think we could really keep this interactive and discuss this. So let me start with us here today. And Aneta, in some ways, we can talk about how this EHDS framework, and as you mentioned, boost overall competitiveness. And could you elaborate perhaps how you see, Stefan had mentioned the RWE initiatives. I was really captivated by the possibility of RWE. We've talked about this even in the US, of how that might be used. And you had mentioned, Stefan, on how that might be able to fill some gaps in therapeutic areas where treatments are currently unavailable. Perhaps you could speak about this, or Stefan, both of you, but maybe start us off, Aneta, on your thoughts there on how the industry sees that.
Yes, thank you very much. And indeed, you've mentioned competitiveness. I think that now Europe is definitely shifting its attention into boosting competitiveness, and certainly paving a way to more evidence-based, data-driven decision-making would be an important accelerant in that context. But moving back to the European health data space and more sort of where the industry sees the potential, but also what are still the aspects that needs to be addressed. So representing the innovative-based industry, where data is critical to all what we do, from identifying trends to testing hypotheses to developing the medicines and monitoring their performance in real life, it is all very much dependent on the availability of data. And in order to fill the gaps in our knowledge on the areas where the current therapeutic options are not existent or not satisfactory, we now complement this knowledge generated in a strictly controlled environment in the randomized clinical trials with real-world data. So there is a great potential of real-world data to answer the questions that otherwise would not be answered. It can help us in gathering information from the diverse population that sometimes for ethical reasons would not be included in clinical trials, as well as it can finally accelerate the development of innovative solutions for patients with rare diseases, where the patient sample size is too small to conduct research. So there is a great potential with that. Nonetheless, as you know, and many of you also alluded in your questions, Europe is highly fragmented when it comes to access to data, so that's mainly related to the divergent interpretation of GDPR. We have an issue with the quality of data because from the outset, the data during the collection is not meant to meet the highest scientific standards. And also we have the poor interoperability of systems of different frameworks, which again prevents us from collecting the data from across different member states, across different databases. So with this in mind, the European health data space has a potential to drive greater consistency interpretation of GDPR by providing us with a one-stop shop in every member state, so the health data access body, to access the data from and also have a sort of a visibility on what type of data is being available in every member state. It can drive greater standardization in the very important types of data like electronic health records, like patient registers that hold valuable information about patients. At the same time, it can, as I already mentioned before, can provide this consistent sort of data access models. Nonetheless, again, its success would very much depend on providing the right balance between sharing a broad range of different data types, while at the same time providing the clarity on obligations for data holders and data users. And as an industry, we have been already quite diligent and we've been starting to prepare for the implementation of the EHDS. Nonetheless, without further clarity on the actual interpretation of these key fundamental provisions, this is not possible. Hence, our position is to the European Commission, to the European Union, to start working together with the stakeholders, with the industry that has a long sort of knowledge of working and accessing and using the data in a strictly controlled environment for the sort of greater public good to develop medicines. So in terms of the provisions that are particularly relevant for us, and I've seen that many of you ask the questions about them, are even about the territorial scope of the EHDS, which is not defined, as GDPR has an extraterritorial scope, or the AI Act, what that has recently adopted, and certainly you have heard of it, it's very clear that it has an extraterritorial scope. For the EHDS, we do not know. The opt-out, member states can decide how they want to implement it. So it can really cause a very fragmented approaches, not mentioning that it will have an impact of data availability on the diversity of data that is being available for research, but also it will impact on the public-private partnership in Europe. More importantly, also, we would be obliged to share a broad range of data that we currently have, including the data from clinical trials. However, the data categories are still, I would say, rather broadly defined. And for example, the genetic data can be held in different databases by the pharmaceutical industry. So we need to exactly understand in which format, what type of data shall be made available. And at the same time, I would say that we will be obliged to share the data containing intellectual property and commercially sensitive information, and the data holder will not have a right to refuse access to data because that would be a health data access body acting as an intermediary and deciding whether such data shall be shared with data user. There are also some aspects related to international transfer of data that we think need to be clarified as early as possible, giving a more liberty to member states to add additional safeguarding mechanisms where data shall be shared outside of the EU. So as you can see, there is still many questions to be answered. Although, again, this is really the great potential, definitely.
Thank you so much for giving us a broad scope of, some of the challenges as well as some of the promises of the health data space. And you covered them fairly broadly. I mean, David McAllister, what are your thoughts? I mean, I think Aneta covered them broadly, but as a researcher, I'd love to hear your perspective on, this is obviously in the future, but you've access data both from Vivli as well as other spaces. And what are your thoughts on how you might access data in the future health data space as you understand it at this time? You know, both RWE and other types of perhaps clinical trial data.
So,
And the usefulness and utility.
yeah. So researchers obviously like to do research. So I think one of the key issues is, you know, is the trial data, is it going to be individual level participant data that we're able to access through this federated system, or is it going to be aggregate? If it's going to be aggregate, what kind of aggregate data? Is it going to look like a kind of table 1 in a published trial paper, or are we going to get something a little bit finer grained, maybe some information about joint variables? Either is fine. The type of research questions we can answer with individual level participant data are different, but you can still do lots of really interesting things with aggregate data. You know, you can study trial representativeness. You can even do things like reweight trials to try and improve the representativeness. You can look at underserved populations. You can do lots of interesting kind of research about research. I think that a really key issue is going to be discoverability and finding out early what you're going to be able to get and whether it's going to be useful. You don't want to go through a 2-year process and then get data and find out that it's absolutely no use to you. So I think that we need to think hard about metadata, you know, data about the data and standards for that, making it machine readable, kind of interoperability, thinking about the role of kind of synthetic data, not synthetic data for making inferences, which is really hard, but synthetic data for knowing what the data will look like, which is, you know, much easier. So that's what I'd like to say. And in terms of as NICE, you know, the kind of regulators, there it's aggregate data you want. You know, do the people in this trial look like the kind of people who have this disease and who might be considered for this treatment?
Yes. I mean, Steffen, any reaction to what David just said?
No, first of all, Aneta, thank you for answering some questions online. You've been much closer to the legal discussions in Brussels than I have been, so you know much more details. No, I completely agree with you, David. And the proof is in the pudding here. We need to see where this will go in terms of utility of these data. Thinking about your previous question about real-world evidence, Rebecca, you know, we are very keen on utilizing and establishing the use of, because this is going to be real-world evidence that comes out of Darwin. And sometimes I've been asked, isn't it just the good old retrospective studies you're talking about? And is it just old wine on new bottles, or maybe just old wine with a new label? But we want to go beyond the use for pharmacovigilance and safety monitoring. We want to establish real-world evidence as a supplement to the data that's the important word here, to supplement to data from randomized controlled trials. Last year I was in a meeting with cardiology trialists and talking about real-world evidence, and it was like swearing in church. Because they only believe in randomized controlled trials. So talking about real-world evidence was definitely a no-go. So I had to repeatedly explain to these guys that I'm talking about supplementing the evidence from the randomized controlled trials. And I think this is important, and as I told you, this is my 3rd conference this week, and the 2 past conferences had been on digital health technologies and on decentralized clinical trials. And collecting digitized data in a decentralized clinical trial is actually also generating real-world evidence.
Yes.
So it will mean that you have a randomized, the golden standard clinical trial that also have a component of real-world data. And I think that's suddenly become interesting, not only for us as a regulatory authority in answering the question, did that clinical trial actually reflect or is the clinical trial reflective of the real world where the intended use of this product is going to be? And it will be maybe even more interesting for the payers downstream to say, how do we already now get a flavor of how this is impacting real life of patients in their decision making? And we could even go, and this is far, far outside my remit, but it's clear that the payment model for pharmaceuticals, where you pay per tablet fundamentally, is flawed for some therapies. New antibiotics to treat antimicrobial resistance, these products will be shelved. They are only to be used in certain cases. You will never get your investment back unless you have another payment model. Therapies for rare conditions, the same holds here. So we have to think about a pay-for-performance model or another payment model. And their real-world evidence is actually also relevant, because you could say then, of course, there will be pharma who gain from this. There definitely also be pharma who will lose from this, because clinical trial may either over or underestimate the clinical benefit of these products. But if you are going to be reimbursed based on real-world data, that's suddenly a new way of thinking.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, both of you. And David Leventhal, so, just following on from what Aneta said, do you see, from the Pfizer perspective, EHDS providing either a consistent framework to support industry development, for example, in Pfizer, for example, in drug development, perhaps utilizing the real-world data?
I do, obviously. So Aneta, I think, covered a lot of the challenges, so I don't need to belabor those. But I think there are real opportunities with tying interventional clinical trial data with real-world evidence, as you had indicated. But I think there are some details there around, well, what does that mean around tokenization? Do we have to start thinking about that as a common practice when we're initiating clinical trials? And again, we live in a world, and I'm not going to speak as industry, but I think as sponsors of clinical research, live in a world where we're not supposed to know the identities of those individuals. So how do you ensure the privacy and confidentiality of those individuals while making sure that it is tied to their electronic health record? But I think that creates tremendous opportunity. I think around clinical trial recruitment, which is dogs every sponsor of research, the ability to potentially have a geographic reach, understand, be able to do disease modeling geographically, and be able to offer clinical trial opportunities through EHDS to individuals and recruit them. I think that's an amazing opportunity. I think it also, from a retention perspective, we have the ability, presumably, to return the data from the clinical trial back to the individual. This is something that Pfizer has been working on in the United States, and we feel very strongly about. But now you potentially could actually have it show up in their electronic health record, which I think creates a great user experience for them. They're more likely to stay in the trial and not drop out. So I think there's tremendous opportunity there on top of the scientific power that comes from all of this, which I don't feel well equipped to represent, but the opportunity is great.
Of course. So, David McAllister, you mentioned aggregate data. So, Steffen, perhaps you should clarify for the audience, when you are sharing data eventually for clinical trials, would that be at the aggregate level or the patient level data?
Well, the data you currently can access on our website is aggregated data. You can request access to full data set, but that will very rarely be granted. You're going to have a good reason to do so. Again, coming back to my first slide where I spoke about the difference between US FDA and us, is that we rarely do our assessment based on the raw data. We request raw data from time to time, but we don't have the FDA approach of give us the data, we'll tell you the result. We actually trust the company's analysis and look. So we actually assess based on aggregated data in the file. But we are running a current project on raw data to see if raw data, with or without using real-world evidence as well, can improve improve our decision-making process. But the data you get, back to your question, Rebecca, is the data you get access to are aggregated data.
Okay, thank you. So, David McAllister, now that you've heard this, what challenges might arise from integrating this type of data into your work? Any thoughts about that? as a follow-on?
So, can I talk about an opportunity first?
Of course.
Because I think we have this world of trial data and this world of routinely collected healthcare data, and they don't meet very well. So, I mean, it sounds amazing. So, for example, you can look at, so many studies have been done where people have taken trial eligibility criteria and then applied that to a routine data set and said 10% of patients are eligible, 20%. And then similarly, you can look at the trial and you can say, okay, who's screened and then who gets through into the randomization. What would be great here is you could go from end to end. You could have kind of population-level data about who's actually getting into clinical trials, what they're like in terms of the index conditions and age and sex and race, ethnicity and comorbidity. So that would be a new opportunity, and I think that would be really exciting.
Yeah, and that's one that doesn't currently exist.
No, I don't think it does. The best you can do is kind of sort of stratify on patient characteristics and make guesses. So that would be brand new. Challenges, I think, are, you know, Hadley Wickham, this kind of R guru guy that's done lots of packages for the stats system. You know, he said that, like, you know, 90% of work in data analysis is data cleaning and harmonization. It's probably 98, you know. So, you know, if you've got a 5-year project, you'll spend 4 years and 11 months cleaning the data and then 1 month doing the analysis. So with this vast amount of data, the danger is you're just going to drown in data harmonization. So I think we need code sharing, we need standards. Researchers need to do better as well. You know, secondary researchers, we rely on other people's data. I'm not sure that we're as good at sharing our intermediate products as we should be.
Okay. So what questions do you have for each other? I know I've asked a lot of questions to you, but what questions do you have for each other? Aneta? I'll start with you.
Yes, thank you. I actually have a question to Steffen. So
Of course.
it's more about the future indeed and the incorporation of Darwin EU in the EHDS. So as far as I understood, Darwin EU will be also serving sort of as a node, or it would be EMA serving as a node. So I'm just thinking of how what EMA is creating now, you know, with Darwin EU, of how that would then somehow be incorporated at the broader scale. And then that's question linked to that. You've mentioned that the health data, that the HTA bodies might be also using that data to inform their decisions. That's obviously in long-term objective. So then how actually, if we have such a broad range of sources available that were not really maybe, I would say, curated somehow, if I can call it that way, how we ensure that they meet the highest scientific standards, that they provide the right question, right answers to the very specific questions that such an authorities might have.
Yeah, thank you for that, Aneta. If we start with the discussion around the future of Darwin, whether Darwin at some point will be incorporated or metabolized by the European health data space, maybe in a distant future, yes. But I think to start off with, we will keep Darwin, again, now it has been a pathfinder, but maybe moving forward more as an experimentation room where we can potentially also, we don't know how fast access we can get to data in the health data space, as I alluded to in my presentation. So maybe we need to have Darwin as a fast access to answer urgent regulatory questions. I don't think we have made up our final mind on where this will go, but as I see it, and we have until 2030 to do our thinking as well, I think we will maintain Darwin as a separate system with those data partners that serves specific purposes for quick regulatory decision making. In terms of the validity of the research questions, and again, we don't know how this is going to work in details for the health data space, but the way we've done it in Darwin, as I guess you know, Aneta, we have this data review board at Erasmus, at the coordination center. So you eventually submit your research protocol that is then being scrutinized, kind of peer reviewed, and we don't say yes to all the products, all the protocols, and maybe some of the protocols need to be tweaked. So we make sure that the research question is relevant and potentially, hopefully also relevant from a regulatory perspective, and that the research is being done, it's scientifically valid. And I think we need to keep the flag high here, because if it could also be a reputational damage to the European health data space if we see a lot of scientifically low standard, crappy, maybe not even real research coming out of it, being misused, being turned into misinformation and disinformation. It's in nobody's interest. So I think we need to have a similar system for the European health data space, where we make sure that the research questions are valid, or at least that the protocols are scientifically valid. Did that answer your question, Aneta?
Mm-hmm. It seems like, yes, it seems like there's so much riding on this, Health Data Access Board, or the governance. And, having set up Vivli, I realize there's so much that people think about is, around the technical piece, but the governance really has to be thought about very closely. And I'm sure that you're really putting a lot of effort into that. So, David Leventhal, I know your team at Pfizer is probably thinking a great deal about the rollout of this. And can you tell me just a bit, whatever you can share, about the steps that you're thinking about mitigating some of the challenges? We've spoken a lot about that. Aneta has talked about this, and I'm sure companies like yours are thinking about how to mitigate any of the bumps in the road that we saw with GDPR and the lessons that we've learned with GDPR. What are you thinking about to ensure a smooth transition? I know it's years down the road, and the lessons learned there.
Yeah, so I can talk about what we're doing at Pfizer, but I also think industry as a whole is taking some steps. So operational readiness, well, I'm an operations person, so that's primarily what we're looking into. What is the headcount that we're going to need to manage all of this? What is the do we have to have a catalog of studies that we make available? And in many cases, we're using kind of all the questions when we signed on with Vivli. What is it that we need to do to be able to fulfill a request through Vivli? And I think it's an interesting question. What role does Vivli potentially play in the EHDS structure, either as a teaching opportunity or even as a potential service provider in such a world? So we're looking at, okay, what is the projected demand? What do we have to do around preparation of our studies for sharing, the anonymization schemas and the governance around all of that? So those are swirling as we're trying to figure this all out. We are also thinking about the opportunities, right? So I mentioned things like tokenization. So there'll be there's the past of clinical trials, and then there's the future of clinical trials. So what do we need to do to prepare those studies that have happened in the past? And some of them are even things on paper where you have to go and find things in boxes, or preparing data. And then what does the future look like? So what is this new thing? Are we tokenizing each of our clinical trial participants so that they can link together with the electronic health record within Europe? How do we separate the European participants from the rest of world participants, and how do we make sure that those are not getting that the data protections are in place for those individuals? And so I think there's a broad question for us, and I'd like David at McAllister to chime in. So for a large pharma company which has resources to be able to do this, this is going to apply to all sponsors of research. So the little investigator at a university who has a very limited budget, they too will be called upon to do this. And how do we create whatever subsidies or whatever it is to raise all the boats so that we can operate in this space? So there's a lot there, but that's kind of the things that we're thinking about. The last bit is that there is this work through the Innovative Health Initiative called the Share HD project, where we're going to try to answer these questions around anonymization and governance and CCI and making sure that data privacy concerns are addressed and that we can both influence but also play in the space operationally.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. I hadn't thought about investigators, which I'm not sure why I hadn't thought that, as they run their own clinical trials, they will have to also comply with this. And that's actually a large audience that will have to think about this very thoughtfully as they comply with this, initiative. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to turn to questions from the audience. We do have some rolling in virtually, but if you have questions, you want to raise your hand, we can take them to the panel and bring them. I do have, go ahead, question? Dan, is it Dan?
It's Matt.
Oh, Matt, sorry.
Yeah, Matt Rotelli from Eli Lilly. Thank you. So I think, obviously governance is going to be very, very important. It sounds like, for example, for Darwin, you have a governing body set up to do approval. Are there documented scientific and ethical principles that governance body uses? And if so, can they be published? And then also, is there any transparency into the ongoing projects, not just the completed projects?
I'm unsure about the whether there's a written governance structure. I'm pretty sure there is. That I have to say, I don't know in details what happens there. With regard to projects, yes, if you submit a project to Darwin, as it is now, it's going to be submitted. There is a database for pharmacoepidemiological studies in Europe. It has yet another acronym, which I've forgotten on the top of my head here, but it will be published there. So already when you have the protocol, your protocol will be there, and the results will come there afterwards. But Dave, now I have the microphone. You said something that triggered something in my head about the off-the-shelf studies, because that's also the way we have been thinking in Darwin, that there may be certain studies that we want to run on a regular basis, annually, biannually, to look into how things are developing. So these we call off-the-shelf studies. And so there we have a protocol, we have an algorithm that we can apply to our data, and we can get the answer within weeks. And then we will have studies that will more be commissioned based on a question that comes out on a product-related issue or committee-related issue, and then maybe broader, longer-scale scientific relevant studies looking into drug utilization. So we will have different sets of studies, and some of them, and again, we don't know how fast we're going to be able to do things in the health data space, but being able to run an algorithm quickly on a set of data to get an update on how is the situation is also important from a regulatory perspective. And that could be regulatory going beyond the Medicines Agency. That could be the Center for Disease Control that could have an interest in chipping into data in the health data space to see how an epidemic is developing or resistance is developing among bacteria. So I see a lot of opportunities here to do quick checks on health, if possible.
Yeah, I'll just say, I see tremendous opportunities here, but to the point, like, you're going to have to carry the public along with us, and we're going to have to be very, very transparent. And I think that's where, no matter how robust internally we think we have things set up, being able to verbalize that, and frankly, even getting input through the education and interactions as we set it up will be key to the success of this, because then I think people will be more comfortable with contributing their data, with tokenization of their clinical trial data, so that it can be matched up with this. And all those things are really going to come from having that foundation of trust, and that's where I think we need to get the principles in place, get them out in front of the public, and carry everybody along with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. I have a question from Fergus Sweeney.
Hi, Fergus.
Fergus, Steffen says hi. Can researchers and developers ask questions to be answered by Darwin? For example, on a particular cancer prevalence in the EU, and the demographic and other characteristics of the patient population for that particular tumor or tumor type?
Who can ask questions?
Can researchers ask ask
Yeah, fundamentally,
questions
yes.
to be answered by Darwin.
In principle, yes, they can submit the protocol to Darwin and have that reviewed. Yes, so that's fundamentally possible. Sponsors or commercial sponsors, at the moment, I don't think can do this. But of course, they could go for scientific advice at EMA and say, we have this issue, and then we could do the data analysis. Thanks for that question, Fergus.
Can I just only confirm that indeed that sponsors do not have the same possibility. We can only actually weigh in when there is evidence has been used on a complex study. So just to clarify that that's correct, actually. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Aneta. Yes, David?
Sorry, Rebecca, I was wondering if I
McAllister.
could come back on the protocol question.
Of course, yes,
Just because
absolutely.
I think that, from industry, you're usually thinking about clinical questions. I mean, I know in drug development they do really innovative statistics and things, but I think for the protocol, if you're asking the question, does this drug work in older people? You want a highly detailed protocol that you're going to follow before you even open the data. But if you're asking a question like, what's the best way to fit a statistical model when I have partially redacted anonymized data? You're probably going to discover what you're doing as you go along. So I would like to see a protocol submission system that's appropriate to the type of research question being asked.
Excellent point. Thank you. David Leventhal, did you have a point or any thoughts before we move on?
No.
Okay.
Happy.
Thank you.
Next question.
Any other questions from the audience before we move on to the virtual questions? Okay. Another one from Matt from Biogen.
Into it, but there we go. I have to
Okay,
brush
thanks.
my teeth really hard with this one. I agree 100% that it needs to be customized and that different types. But one of the things I think we have to be very cautious of is we have seen in the past how sometimes retrospective observational research can have a really big impact on policy decisions, and that needs to be very, very reliable. It's a different approach, different methodology relative to a randomized clinical trial, but when it's going to have that kind of impact, there needs to be the appropriate rigor, validation, plan in place for it, and there needs to, again, be these principles. But I do think those principles need to be right-sized for the type of questions. That's a fantastic point.
I think one other, I'll take the opportunity then. I think around pragmatic trials, and as you say, not having direct access through Darwin. I mean, many of these pragmatic trials are done, in partnership with clinical care. I think you can work through kind of a sub-I or work in partnership to answer some of these pragmatic questions and then get the answers that you would need to kind of make some decisions as you would go into a more detailed late stage clinical trial. So.
Thank you. So how exactly will you link clinical trial data with the personal health records of a trial participant? There was some discussion of tokenization, and how will that work in practice?
Well, that's a pretty good question, and I don't think I know at the moment. I think it comes back to the point that Aneta said that it's not described in detail in the legislation.
Okay.
We're gonna do implementing act and so forth before we can. But it's a good question. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions?
So while you think about questions and completely, well, not unrelated, but maybe a little bit off the topic here. Now we've been talking about real-world evidence. Health data space, digital literacy. We also need to think about the curriculum that is being taught at med school and pharmacy schools, because we are changing the paradigm around data. Not changing, but we are expanding the paradigm. So we need also to make sure that all the new doctors and research coordinators and pharmacists and so forth is aware of what is happening there. And to David McAllister's point, there's also a lot of new methods that are being developed here that we need to teach methodologists as well. So, yeah.
That's an excellent point, and maybe that's something that we could work with you, and we have a number of clinicians here that are we can talk about moving that forward. Chris? Yes, one last question. I'm getting a time check here.
Hi, thank you. Chris Wolston, Head of Science Policy for Sanofi. David Leventhal, I think I heard you suggest the possibility that industry may have to disaggregate the data in our clinical trials and select just the data from European participants, possibly to share back to the EHDS. That's not something I had considered before, but I mean, it's a very good point. And I'm wondering, and I don't know whether this is David McAllister or Stefan, how does that work in terms of the expectation and objectives of the EHDS if what you're going to get from the industry studies or any multi-regional study is an incomplete data set?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's an obvious one that, you know, we would only get we will get a part, yeah. From the primary use, it makes sense that you as a European patient where we have a data health base, you have been part of a global clinical trial, you take access to your own data. But of course, if you then want as a researcher to retrofit the clinical trial based on the data that you have in the health data space, that will be a no-go because not a no-go, it will not be scientifically valid because you will have a subgroup of the patient. But that being said, you may have data from a clinical trial of European patients that's taken together with other data from either other clinical trials or from routine healthcare that can give you a picture. So I think it depends on your scientific question you put into the health data space.
If you can link the trial data with the real world data.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for our panelists today. We're now going to a break. We actually are starting off a data use implementation group that we're leading. If any of you are interested, we'd love to have you join us. And we're partnering with MRCT on this. So please join us. There's a QR code up here. So we're launching this shortly. So please do join us, and we'd love to have you join us in this work group. We are also having an upcoming webinar in January talking about navigating clinical trial data sharing under the new Declaration of Helsinki, and that is launching in January. So also these are two announcements. We'll toggle them during the break. So these are two things that are upcoming from Vivli and MRCT. So thank you so much. If you'd like to, interested in either one of us, see myself or Julie. So thanks again. And we have a 15-minute break. Please come back on time for our next session led by Barbara Beer.